So, what we were doing yesterday, obviously, was completing the square. And some of those, obviously, you guys saw some of those problems. We had some fractions, and it was really kind of a little extra to solve the questions because they're a little bit harder with the fractions. The completing the square method can be used to solve any quadratic, but sometimes it's, let's be honest, it's kind of garbagey to use that method. Okay, now, another method that you can definitely always use to solve a quadratic is the quadratic formula. And if I can't factor something or it wouldn't be easy to complete the square, this I said I would tell you is your go-to method because it's going to work for any quadratic. You just have to be able to identify the A, B, and C values. Okay, now I typed it on the paper for you because I didn't want anybody to miswrite any of it, but that's your quadratic formula. We are going to go through the proof of this a little bit later in the week, but once you have your equation, the one key before you identify your A, B, and C values, you got to make sure the equation is set equal to 0, okay? So, and it has to be, like, everything needs to be multiplied out, standard form, and then set equal to 0. You do not have to have your squared term be positive here. That's completely up to you. As long as the equation is set equal to 0 and you identify your A, B, and C values from that, plug them in, and we're just going to use the calculator to help us out on a lot of these questions today. Okay, so I tried, not all of them are like this, but I tried to make it, just make you aware you got to set it equal to 0 before you start the problem. So this, I've got 3x squared minus x equals 4. Just want to do one quick little step. I'm going to subtract 4 and set that equal to 0. Once you do that, you're going to identify your A, B, and C values to plug into the quadratic formula you got up there. You do not have to write these down or anything. I'm going to write it down on my paper. A is going to be whatever's in front of x squared. So for this problem, it's 3. B is going to be whatever's in front of x. It just has a subtraction symbol, so it's just going to be -1. And C is going to be your constant. Now, I had to move that 4 to the other side of the equation. When I did that, I subtracted it. So when I plug it into the quadratic formula, I would actually plug that in as a -4. All right, now, here's your quadratic formula up here. This gives you 2 answers because of the plus or minus if 2 answers exist, and we're going to go over that today. So opposite of B for this question would actually be +1. Opposite of B is going to be +1. Plus or minus square root. B squared is going to be -1 squared. 4 times your A value is 3 times your C value is -4. Everybody over 2A. Don't forget the 2A. I always feel like people will do the top of the fraction. They'll forget the bottom. But that whole thing is all your quadratic formula. Now, here's just my advice, because there's a lot going on here, right? I usually grab my calculator and I don't type the square root. I just type what's under the square root. So -1 squared minus 4 times 3 times -4. Just real quick. And I simplify whatever's under the radical by just using my calculator here. Or you could do it by hand if you want to. But that should be 49. All right, and then the bottom 6. I did not take the square root. I just plugged in that b squared minus 4ac to my calculator. So I still need to take the square root. But what's the square root of 49? Okay, so this is nice, right? So our 2 answers are going to be nice here. So this is 1 plus or minus 7 over 6. Now, you can actually add the 1 and the 7. So do 1 plus 7 divided by 6. That's going to give you 8 over 6. And if you get something you could reduce, go ahead and do that. So one of our answers, since both of those are divisible by 2, that'll be 4 over 3. Now, my other answer, I'm just going to come over to this side of the page, would be 1 minus 7 divided by 6. So that would give you negative 6 over 6, which is just going to give you -1. So my 2 answers for that question, you don't have to write out all that work. I'm just trying to show you where it comes from. -1 and 4/3. And if you want to plug them back into the original, they should make your equation true. Is anybody having a question? I'm trying to do kind of like one of each type of thing you might run into here. So that is a quadratic equation that has 2 real answers. If we graphed this, it would cross your x-axis at -1 4/3, which is like 1 1/3. All right, now, the one next to this, again, you got to make sure you got set up so you're equal to 0 to start the problem. So for this guy, I got to add 9 to both sides before I start. So I'm going to have x squared plus 6x plus 9 equals 0. Again, you totally don't have to write this. I'm going to write it on my paper, though. A is going to just be 1. You just have a plain x squared. B is going to be 6. C is going to be 9. And then we're just going to plug these guys into the quadratic formula. Opposite of b here would be -6 plus or minus square root. B squared is going to be 6 squared for this problem. 4 is part of the formula. A is 1 and C is 9. Everybody over 2a, so it's going to be 2 times 1 here. And again, this is just, because there's a lot of different things you're plugging in there. I usually just try to simplify like a little piece at a time. So I'm not using the square root. I'm just going to type what's under the square root. So b squared, 6 squared, 4 times, I don't really need to put the 1 in there. I don't know why I did that, because that's just going to give me 4, but 4ac. Now this one's a little different. So I did not take a square root. I got 0. This is 36 minus 36 is what you have under that radical. Okay, what's the square root of 0? 0. All right, so I have -6 plus, you can take the square root of 0, totally legal. 0 times 0 is 0, so it's a square root, its own square root. Okay, what do I get if I add 0 to -6? What do I get if I subtract 0 from -6? Okay, so do you guys understand? So this literally would just be one answer here, because I'm adding 0, subtracting 0. That's not going to change anything. So it's just -6 over 2, which is just -3. Okay, if you get a question like this, where we got 0 under the square root, we just had one answer, right? Let me just show you real quick. If I sketch this on a graph, and I'm just doing like a tiny sketch, so it would just touch the x-axis at -3. The graph of this would look something like that. It would, if you just have one answer, then the vertex is going to touch the x-axis. That's how that would work. If I did this question, and you don't have to sketch a graph of these, but if I did this question, I'd be crossing at -1 and like 1 1/3, so the graph would look like something like that. But it would cross the x-axis in 2 different places, whereas if you just have one answer, that just means the vertex is going to touch the x-axis. Does anybody have any question? Yeah. Yes, yeah, no. I'm just showing you all the possible things. Yes. Would I have solved this using the quadratic formula? No. Miss Grody would have either completed the square because it's easy because you got an even b value, or I would have factored that, to be honest with you. I would not have used a quadratic formula on that. But yeah, that's why we're going through all these different methods, because there's different ways. The quadratic formula will always work, but yeah, if there's a method that you are like, this would be way faster, why am I writing all this out? Go for it. That's fine with me. I'm just trying to show you what it's going to look like. Okay, very good question. So there are different methods you could use. Some of these can be factored, and if you wanted to do that instead, that's fine. I'm just going to show you what it's looking like today using the quadratic formula. Okay, now this beautiful question here. Again, we got to set equal to 0, so I'm going to add x squared. Now, I already have a 2x squared on the other side, so we're just going to have to combine like terms, no big deal. This gives me 3x squareds. The 4x and the -2 are not going to change. My a value then 3, b is 4, and c is -2. Okay, now I'm going to show you a little bit on this one, 2 different types of answers. We would not have run into that before, so this will make a little bit more sense hopefully in a second. All right, opposite of b would be -4, plus or minus square root. B squared is going to be 4 squared here, minus 4 part of the formula, times a, 3 for this problem, times c, which is -2 for this problem, everybody over 2a, so 2 times 3. So -4 plus or minus. Now again, not the square root. I'm just going to type what's under the square root on my calculator to help myself a little bit here. So 4 squared minus 4 times 3 times -2, and I got 40. All right, so so we had a perfect square and we had 0. This is not a perfect square. This is all over 6. What you want to do if you don't get a perfect square, want to kind of throw back to what we were doing earlier in the unit and actually break down the radical. So if you are a factor tree person, please factor tree away. I like to find the biggest perfect square because I just think it's faster because that's how I learned it. But however you want to do it is fine with me. This would, if you do the biggest perfect square, the only perfect square that goes into that is actually going to be 4. Now just do me one quick favor, because a lot of times people will break this down right, but then they'll put like a 4 on the outside. No. We're taking the square root of 4, so that's what allows me to remove that perfect square. So this should have a 2 in front of it, and then the 10 should be under the square root. What I'm going to then do is just rewrite that, but I'm going to replace that radical 40 with the simplified radical form, which is going to be 2 roots of 10. All right, so I got -4 plus or minus 2 roots of 10, everybody over 3. I mean, I don't know why I just wrote 3. It says 6. Fail. Okay. Now, let me ask you this. Can I simplify, yes, what I had there? Okay, anything else? Like, how would you write your answer? Yep. Perfect. Okay. Now here's the deal. Don't even look at the radical there. It has to be all 3 of these numbers around the plus minus symbol on the top and bottom. So like -4, 2, and 6, those are all divisible by 2. If not all 3 of them, don't touch it. But if all 3 of them are divisible, you can reduce that. I'm going to put this on my paper just really quickly. 2 divided by 2 would have kind of a 1 in front of that square root. You're just not going to see that on an answer key or anything like that. But that I am dividing 2 by 1. And don't touch the radical. Like, that doesn't change into radical 5. It stays radical 10. You don't touch that, just the number in front. And then everything is reducible. I don't think that's a word. If you can reduce everything by something, then you're allowed to. Otherwise, leave it alone. Okay, now I'm going to distinguish something for you here real quick. This is what we call 2 exact answers. Okay, meaning I didn't take a square root here because I couldn't, like we did the other question. Square root of 0, 0, we can do that. Square root of 49 with 7, we can do that. This is called an exact answer if you leave the radical in the problem. Okay, some of the questions are going to ask you, and we'll do this more on the back, for what we call an approximate solution. Okay, literally the only thing you're going to do differently is actually type this mess into your calculator. So I'm going to take -2 plus the square root of 10, and then I'm going to divide that by 3. And I'm just going to write not an equal. Have you guys seen this before? It's like a little squiggle with that. That just means it's approximately equal to, because I'm going to round this. And I'm just going to ask you to do 2 decimal places nearest 100. Okay, now here's the deal. If you do this, you want to do, I'm going to do -2 plus, I'm just typing in square root of 10. Okay, then do me this, just this one favor, okay? Hit equals, and then divide it by 3. Otherwise, the calculator follows the order of operations, and it would take and do that division first. So take the top, do -2 plus square root of 10, hit equals, and then divide it by 3. Yes? Yes, ma'am. So we got 2 answers here. So this guy's about 0.38. The other answer, we would do -10 or -2 minus square root of 10 over 3. And again, these are what we call approximate answers. There should be 2 of them though, because we've got the plus and minus symbol. So again, I'm just going to do -2, and I'm going to do minus square root of 10, hit equals, and then divide it. Oh shoot! Oh my gosh, fired. All right, minus square root of 10, hit equals, and then divide it by 3. And so about -1.72 if I round that to the nearest hundredth. Okay. You got a question on one? Yeah. Did I do it wrong? No, fired again. You're right. All right. It's twice in one period, 0.39. It didn't even round it like I told you guys. I apologize. 0.39, you're totally right. Okay. So exact means you leave the radical, and approximate means I take the square root with my calculator and just round it to the nearest 2 decimal places, hopefully correctly, unlike I just did. And then the other 2 I didn't need to do that for because we had perfect squares under the square root. Okay, and I have one last one that looks a little different. Again, I want to set this equal to 0. So I'm going to add 7. And so it'd be 2x squared plus 6x plus 7 equals 0. So I'm going to add the 7 to move it to the other side. So A would be 2, B would be 6, and C would be 7. All right, so we had one with 2 answers, one with 1 answer, one with approximate and exact answers because it had a radical. So here's our last one. Opposite of B here would be -6 plus or minus square root 6 squared minus 4 times 2 times 7. Everybody over 2a, here it's going to be 2 times 2. Again, I just grab my calculator here and I simplify what's under the radical, but I don't actually type the square root. So I'm going to do 6 squared minus 4 times 2 times 7. I got -20. Everybody over 4. What kind of answers are we going to have here? We have to go into imaginary land because we have a negative under the square root. Now, you just break down that -20 under the square root just like you would a regular number. So -20 under the square root. If you want to do factor tree away. I would do biggest perfect square. So I would do -4. And I just attach the negative to the perfect square. Now, when I remove square root of -4 is a perfect square in imaginary land, I would pull that out as a 2i. And then the 5 would stay under the square root. So then what I'm going to do here, I'm just going to replace this radical -20 with the simplified version. So we'd have -6 plus or minus 2i radical 5, everybody over 4. You cannot do an approximate solution with an imaginary number. So if you have an I in here, you're not going to do what I just did where I rounded with the decimal. Your calculator won't do it. It won't like you for that. Well, it might, but it shouldn't. Okay, so only exact answers here. Can I do anything else with what I had there? Yeah. Yeah, no, okay, again, don't touch the radical. All 3 of these numbers are on the plus minus. If they're all divisible by something, you can reduce that. These are all divisible by 2. So as my answer, I'd want to see -3 plus or minus. Now, I'd still have the I there, radical 5, everybody over 2. And then, again, you're not typing this into the calculator with the I. If an I is involved, it's just simplify it as much as you can, but we're not going to write down to the nearest hundredth because you don't want to do that. Is anybody having a question? Yes, word problem. Okay. My favorite. So I do have a teeny tiny bit of review involved with this. So we've seen this. This is your vertical motion. It's the height of an object after t seconds. And it's in feet per second. So you're going to see feet and seconds in the question here. This says a rocket is launched from a 100-foot cliff with an initial velocity of 144 feet per second. Now, the general form is right here. The -16, that's just gravity. -16 feet per second, that's the force of gravity. So anytime you see a feet per second question involving this, you'll see that -16. Now, the initial height the object releases from. A lot of the questions we've done so far, it has started at the ground, so we haven't had an initial height, but this one does. Initial height that I'm launching from is a 100-foot cliff, so that would go in place of C. And then the initial speed or velocity of the object, that just goes in for V. So to write this formula for our particular question, -16t squared plus 144t, and then plus 100. Okay, and I'm just going to sketch you guys a tiny picture here. So, not starting from the ground. So this is not to scale. I'm just going to kind of eyeball. I'm just going to say, okay, this is 100 feet. So we're on a cliff to launch this rocket. And so obviously it would go up in the air, but then eventually gravity is going to bring it back and put it on the ground. So it's not to scale, I'm just drawing a sketch here. Okay, now it says, at what time does the rocket reach its maximum height, and then what is the maximum height for these two questions right here? What am I asking you for in that question? Heck yeah, the vertex. Okay, so maximum or minimum, if it asks you for that, it's just asking you for the vertex. All right, now, do you guys see how this formula is up here? Where you're used to seeing x is t, so the time is going to be like our x coordinate here, and then the height, that's where you guys are used to seeing y in an equation, so that's going to be our y coordinate of the vertex. Okay, so all I've got going on for C and D, this is the time, and this is the height, but they'll go together. How do I figure out the time? Does anybody remember? There's like a little tiny formula. Yes, yes, yes. Okay, this is just negative b over 2a. All right, now, for our problem, what b is 144. So this would be negative 144 over 2 times negative 16. Now, promise me, either put parentheses around this or figure out what the bottom of that fraction is, all right? Because if you just type negative 144 divided by 2 times negative 16, you will get the wrong answer on your calculator. So if you do want to simplify this, this would be 144 over negative 32, which should give me how many seconds? 4.5, good. Okay, now I have the time. So it's going to take 4.5 seconds for the rocket to reach the maximum height. How would I figure out what that height is? Plug it in like a Glade air freshener. Okay, so I don't know why I like saying that. I have probably some kind of mental damage. All right. You already knew that. That's not a surprise. Okay. So we're going to plug in 4.5. Now, I am not doing this by hand because it has a 0.5 and I'm lazy, so we're going to use the calculator to do this. But it is a nice number. Sorry. Excuse me. All right. Probably shouldn't be recording this. Okay, 4.5. You can go back and listen to it. All right. It's not that funny. All right. So I just plugged that in. So everywhere I saw the time, I just replaced it with 4.5 seconds. This will give you your height. So I got 424. This will be feet. All right, now if you want, I'm just going to come back to my little drawing and I'm going to sketch in my vertex. So this is 4.5 and then 424. Okay, now, on this graph, you can't just use, I know this is kind of weird, because I didn't launch from the ground, if I'm going to ask you when it's going to come back down to the ground here in a second, but you can't just multiply 4.5 by 2 and tell me that's 9, because it's not quite right. Since I launched the rocket from 100 feet, if we're just talking about the algebra here, this parabola would intersect the x-axis in a negative spot as well. So you can't use symmetry here to figure out when it's going to come back down to the ground, which I'm going to ask you in a second. Before I ask you that, though, I want to ask you this question in part E. So it says, at what time or times, little parentheses there, so we're probably going to use that, does the rocket reach a height of 343 feet? All right, so see if you agree with this. I started 100. I'm going to go up in the air. Eventually, I'm going to hit 424. And then we're going to come back down to the ground. So between the 100 and 424, this is not to scale, I guarantee it. Somewhere on the way up here, this height would be 433 or 343. Okay, now when the rocket starts to come back down to the ground because of gravity, you would also hit that height on the way back down as well. So this should have 2 answers here. Just keeping that in mind, because it says in the directions at what time, and then it says times in parentheses. This should have 2 answers though, because you're going to hit that on the way up and on the way back down. How would you figure this out? Anybody know? Yeah. Exactly. Okay. So the equation is equal to the height, right? you want to know when it's going to hit a height of 343. So we're just going to sub that in for the height. All right, so 343 equals negative 16t squared plus 144t plus 100. So then, like, how would we solve that? We're just going to use the quadratic formula. I know the numbers on this are kind of big, but it's not a big deal because the quadratic formula works every single time. And if you subtract 343 from 100, we're going to get negative 243. Okay, I know these numbers are big. Now, so pay attention to this. It says round to the nearest hundredth of a second. We are not breaking down the garbage radical you are about to get in this problem. We're just going to use a calculator, okay? So, opposite of b would be negative 144 plus or minus square root. B squared is 144 squared minus 4 times a, negative 16 here. C ends up being negative 243. Everybody over 2a, which is 2 times negative 16. Okay. Now, again, I'm just going to use my calculator to help me out with what's under the radical, and it's a large number, all right? So I've got, covering up my work. All right, let's see here. We got 144 squared minus 4 times negative 16 times negative 243. All right, now, don't get aggravated. Miss Grody is not saying, let's break down this radical. We don't have time for that, okay? All right, I'm mean. I'm not that mean. All right, now, the bottom of this fraction, 2 times negative 16 is negative 32. Now, I know I should have 2 answers, and it just says in the directions we're going to round. So I'm going to get my approximate solution here. Okay, you don't have to write any work out here. Just do one with a plus and one with a minus. So if I do negative 144 plus square root of that, I got 5,184. Please, 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 just hit equals, and then divide it by negative 32. And that's actually a decent number. So 2.25 seconds. So that's where it would hit on the way up. The other answer is going to get me where I'm going to hit the 343 as my height on the way back down. So same thing, but I'm just going to do minus the square root of that 5184. Hit equals, and then divide it by negative 32. And I got 6.75 seconds for that. So those are actually decent. I didn't even round anything. That was just what it was. Okay. Now, the last one, what time will the rocket be back on the ground? So if you're on the ground, your height is 0. And I'm going to pull this back so you can see the picture again. Now, remember I told you can't use symmetry here because I launched from 100 feet, not the ground, so there'd be a negative answer here. I want this answer here. So there should only be one answer to this question because I'm not on the ground over here. I'm not on the ground until I come back down after gravity pulls me back to Earth here on this question. So in place of the height, we're just going to put 0. If you want to, you can, I think everything here is divisible by at least 4. You could do that if you want to work with smaller numbers, and that's completely fine. I'm just going to go ahead and plug this into the quadratic formula just as it appears here. But if you do see a greatest common factor you want to reduce, you are allowed to do that here. I'm just not going to because, frankly, I'm being lazy. Okay, so negative 144 plus or minus square root 144 squared minus 4 times negative 16. Now, times 100. This will be different than the question we just did because my height is 0, not 343, so it's a little different. The bottom of the fraction will be the same still. So it's made negative 32. Okay, now I'm going to ask you to be smart about this. I'm going to ask you a question in a second, but let me figure out what's under that square root. So I'm going to do 144 squared minus 4 times negative 16 times 100. Okay, so huge number. Again, if you were bored and you wanted to factor tree that, okay, I'm not asking you to do that. Doesn't say that. Doesn't say break down the radical. Mean, but not that mean, right? Okay, says round to the nearest hundredth. So that's trying to tell you I want the approximate solution. We're going to round this. Okay, now I got to have you think about this for a second. All right, no, I want to see the picture. There it is. Okay, I can't operate this today. Okay, now, one answer, right? One answer, because this one would be negative, and we can't have a negative time. So, if I'm being smart about this, would I do negative 144 plus that radical or minus? She said minus. Okay, why is it minus? Who knows why it's why am I going to subtract it? Does anybody know? Yeah. Yeah. Negative minus something is not necessarily positive. Why am I using the negative? Okay, you got it. There you go. That's what I was looking for. Okay, on the top, if I do a negative number minus, I don't know what this number is. It's some gross decimal. If you do a negative minus something, the top of the fraction will be negative, then the bottom is negative, and the negatives will cancel out. Now, if you didn't notice this, you just got to remember, if one of your answers is negative, don't pick that because you can't have negative time. But if I do negative 144 minus this square root 27 136, excuse me, hit equals, and then divide it by negative 32. All right, so this is about 9.65 seconds. If I didn't notice that, I was just trying to speed this up. If I didn't notice that, that's okay. If you do plus that square root 27 136 divided by negative 32, it'll give you a negative answer, and you can't have a negative time. So if you forget that, that's okay. But just remember, if you're talking about a time, it has to be positive, so the other answer will not work for this word problem here. Okay, does anybody have a question? Last problem's easy, I promise. Okay, not anything to do with vertical motion. This says, school's jazz band is selling CDs. I probably should change this because I don't think people sell CDs anymore. I don't even know if they make CDs anymore. Okay, says the total profit P depends on the amount X that you charge for the CD. Do you guys even know what a CD is? Okay. I'm not that old. All right. Just check it. Wait, you don't? No. Okay, I was like, what? Okay. I'm like, I'm pretty sure I have one in the closet. Okay. That I listen to in my boombox, which is secretly in there, which you don't know what that is, but anyway. Oh, we do know? We do. Okay. Mine's just a little bit. Anyway, okay. All right. Now, here, this is kind of a weird question. All right, so P is going to be your profit, and it's modeled by this equation. It's got negative x squared plus 48x minus 300. Models the profit for the fundraiser. Okay. This says what is the least amount in dollars that I can charge for a CD to make a profit of $200. Okay, in the equation they give you in the directions, the P is supposed to stand for the profit. So, bless you, you want to make a $200 profit. So I'm just going to put the 200 in place of P. That's what the intention is here. And excuse me, I want to set this equal to 0, and I'm just going to use the quadratic formula. If you're using the quadratic formula, you don't need to worry about whether your squared term is positive or not. So the least amount of work for me to set this equal to 0 would just be to subtract that 200. So I get negative x squared plus 48x minus 500 to set that equal to 0. Totally fine for your squared term to be negative if you're using the quadratic formula. If you were factoring or completing the square, we would not want our squared term to be negative. All right, I'm just going to go ahead and write this. So opposite of b would be negative 48 plus or minus square root 48 squared 4 times my a value is negative 1, my c value is negative 500. Everybody over 2a, which would be 2 times negative 1. Okay, for my lovely square root here, we're just going to do 48 squared minus 4 times negative 1 times negative 500. Okay, not a nice number, that's okay. We're not breaking this radical down because we're going to talk about money here. And I actually, if you do this, both of these answers are going to be positive. Both of these answers are going to be positive here. So I'm going to do negative 48 plus the square root of 304. Just hit equals, and I'm going to divide that by negative 2. Those negatives are going to cancel out. All right, so I added that. I got 15.28. So $15.28. I'm doing 2 decimal places because we're talking about money here for sure. If I do negative 48 minus the square root of 304, hit equals, and then I'm going to divide that by negative 2. I'm going to get 3272 to the nearest hundredth since we're talking about money. Which one of those should be my answer to the question? The 15, right? Because it says what's the least amount we can charge to make this profit, so we would pick the 15.28.